Hello, Neogenians. Welcome to Dawn of the New Earth. Today we're talking about the mysterious goddess Asherah, who was erased from history, the secret wife of God. We're going to be answering the question, why was she suppressed from the Bible? What were her followers like? What's going on with Asherah? Who was she? What was she about? This is going to be really good as we take a look at this individual who is also known as the Queen of Heaven. So we're going to get started right away, as always, but make sure you hit like and subscribe because, hey, my channel is about bringing information out there, spreading information, spreading hidden knowledge. So when you hit like and subscribe, it helps spread this information around. So please do so right now. And I want to remind you that my new book is out, Meta-Rationalism, the New Science of Mind. So if you want to know how this is a mathematical reality and how you can understand your eternal nature, what we are, where we are, why we are here in a rational, logical, and mathematical way, check this out. Both of my books are available right now. The links are in the description of this video. And as always, if you enjoy my work, consider becoming a member. Helps out a lot. Hit the join button right below YouTube here, and you can see all the different perks that you get on the different tiers. We're having a members only video right after this, called Near-Death Experiences versus Psychedelic Trips. What's really going on? That's going to be a good one. So you get access to all of the members-only videos. There's a new one every single week. Our Discord server, we have weekly live classes there. Check it out. There's a lot of great stuff, and I appreciate it very much. And as always, follow me on Spotify as well. Just look up Dawn of the New Earth over on Spotify. All right, my friends, let's get started. If you are new here, my name is Morgue, and I am an ex-Christian bringing hidden knowledge forward to help create a new earth. And today we're taking a look at Asherah, the Queen of Heaven, the wife of God who was erased from the Bible. We've talked about her before, but we're going to dive into a lot more detail and really see what she's all about. There's a lot to unpack here. And I want to mention that I am going to be reading some excerpts from an article on medium.com. So this article is called Who Was God's Wife? And it's by Religion and Politics at the Dinner Table. It's an excellent article, and I really like the articles that this person posts. So if you enjoy some of the excerpts that I read here today, go give them a follow on medium.com. Go give them claps. That's the equivalent of likes over there. And yeah, so that's Religion and Politics at the Dinner Table, Who Was God's Wife? So we're going to see that God's wife, Asherah, actually originates in Sumerian mythology. So the author writes, way back in Sumerian mythology, there was a character that was designated as the wife of An or Anu, one of the supreme deities in the Sumerian mythology, right alongside Enlil and Enki. These are the same three who are responsible for creating man and woman in the Garden of Eden, according to their mythology. Her name was depicted as Ashratum. Then eventually, Asherah in the Canaanite religion. She also had various other names, such as She Who Walks on the Sea. In all of these cases, she was a goddess of fertility and nature who nurtured life and was often associated with sacred trees, including the Tree of Life. Now, this is going to be very important for what we reveal later about Asherah and how she was erased from the Bible. So take a note that she's associated with nature and trees, particularly sacred trees. This is very important. Now, here's an interesting thing. The author says, from Sumerian mythology, she eventually made her way to be adopted as a goddess and the consort of El by various tribes that adopted portions of the Sumerian pantheon, one of those being the Canaanites. So what are we talking about here? The Canaanite religion is the religion that predated Judaism, that Judaism drew a lot of their mythology from. So the Canaanite religion has a pantheon of gods, and this includes El Elyon, the Most High God, Baal, and Asherah, the wife of God. And this is why in the Old Testament in Genesis, you'll notice something very interesting in that God says, let us create mankind in our image. And you can see this a lot in the Old Testament, particularly mostly in Genesis, where God refers to themselves as being multiple beings, as there being multiple beings? Well, because this is where we were in a stage of religion where it wasn't a monotheistic religion at that time. It was a polytheism. But here's the idea. The author says the Canaanites also had another god they attributed with storms and war, a god named Yahweh. So this is crucial for understanding who Asherah was. We have to understand that originally this was a polytheistic religion. The Canaanite religion was a polytheistic religion, and there were many gods: El Elyon, Asherah, Baal, and Yahweh. Yahweh was a storm god, a war god. Now, of course, you'll know Yahweh as being the god that eventually becomes the one true God of Judaism and Christianity. And it says here that Yahweh eventually became the patron god of the Israelites and absorbed many of the traits that had traditionally been attributed to El and Baal. So we have here where the religion essentially went from a polytheism to a henotheism to a monotheism. So it was originally polytheistic, and there were many different gods. Yahweh was just one of them. He was a storm god. He was a war god. Then it became a henotheism, where Yahweh became the most powerful god, but there were still more than one god. That's what a henotheism means. It means that there are multiple gods, but one is the most powerful. And you can see this in the Old Testament where God talks about, I forget the exact verses or phrasing, but it talks about him going to like the council of gods or talking with the gods or something like that. But then eventually it morphed into a monotheism with Yahweh declaring, I am the one true God. There is no other God but me. I am the only God. By the way, the Gnostics hated this. The Gnostics saw this as the ultimate sin, that this was the sin that God, by declaring himself to be the one true God and the only God, sinned against the universe. In their wording, sinned against the entirety, sinned against the all that there is. Why? Well, because when you say, I am the one true God, when all of us are divine, that is sinning against the entirety, because you're trying to attempt to take the divinity away from everything else. If everything is divine, we are divine, and you go, no, I am the only God, you're trying to rip divinity away from everything else. And so the Gnostics were not very happy with this at all. And this is why they saw Yahweh as being an evil deity. The Cathars saw him as being Satan himself. So, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. That's not really what we're talking about today. We're talking more about Asherah and how she fits into all this. So, but one thing that I want to mention that's really interesting. So like I said, the Canaanite religion, it was originally polytheistic. And so you had El Elyon, you had Asherah, God's wife. And sometimes Asherah is even looked at as like the feminine aspect of God. That's sometimes what Asherah is viewed as. But what's really interesting about this is I want to read to you a verse in Genesis where God is creating humanity. And I think that this is very, very telling here. Let's see. This is in Genesis. Where is it? Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image. All right. Notice right away, it's not, I'm going to make mankind in my image. He says, let's make mankind in our image. And it continues, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So there's two really important points here. The first is that there is a multiplicity being referred to here. God isn't saying, I'm going to do this. He's saying, hey, let's do this. Let's create mankind in our image. There's a multiplicity showing a polytheism occurring here. Also, it's showing that God is creating mankind in his image, and he created them male and female, meaning that God would have a male and female aspect. If God is, saying again and again and again, hey, we're going to create mankind in our image, in our image, in our image, and then God created them male and female, Well, you see here is that it's clearly showing that there is a masculine aspect and a feminine aspect in those archetypal terms. But you can see that that's completely eliminated in mainstream Christianity and modern Christianity. And we're going to see that Asherah, as being the queen of heaven and the wife of God, really was very much representative of that feminine aspect of God that was completely deleted from mainstream Christianity. But let's continue here and see what that article has to say. Where did I put it? All right, okay. So Yahweh eventually became the patron god of the Israelites and absorbed many of the traits that had traditionally been attributed to El and Baal. So Yahweh, the storm god, he basically got promoted and he absorbed all the other, he became the most high god. El Elyon was the most high god, but Yahweh became the most high god. He became the creator. He became the one true God. It says El is thought to have been El Elyon. El is thought to have been the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon. El had actually been the father of Yahweh and is considered to have had 70 children that had domain over various regions, Baal being one of Yahweh's siblings. There's a verse that alludes to this. I don't have it on, that I can pull up right away, but it's very interesting. If you guys want to hear more about that later, let me know in the comments. If you want to see a video on how El is the father of God, the father of Yahweh, tell me in the comments, because we could definitely do a video about that. It says Asherah is mentioned as having 70 children and being the consort or wife of El, making her likely Yahweh's mother, although proof of this being the case has not been found. So epithets like El Shaddai, or God Almighty, has been attributed to El, but instead were shifted to Yahweh. So El Shaddai, God Almighty, which was supposed to go with El Elyon, was given to Yahweh. And he became the chief God, the sovereign God, the father God, the protector. And he also gained Asherah as his consort, rather than being the consort of El. So Yahweh also acquired his storm god status and ability to impart divine protection from Baal, it says. So essentially, what we were already talking about. Yahweh absorbed all these traits from these other gods, and because of that, Asherah became his wife. Because he absorbed the traits of Baal and El Elyon, and Asherah was the consort or wife of El Elyon. Since Yahweh absorbed his traits, Asherah became the consort of Yahweh. And so, like I said, Asherah was the queen. She was called the queen of heaven. She was a very powerful mother goddess. She represented fertility, love, and nature. And in ancient Israel, people would actually worship Asherah right alongside Yahweh, because at that specific time, Asherah was considered to be the consort of Yahweh. When it became a monotheistic religion and Yahweh wanted to get rid of all the other gods, this was no longer a positive thing to do, but that's how it was at one point. Archaeologists have even found inscriptions that talk about Yahweh and his Asherah. So let's see. Yeah, it says here, there's been inscriptions on jars that read Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. And it's been found in Tanakh, Kutinlet Adrud, and the temple at Arad. So let's see. Let's take a look now at biblical accounts, because this is important. So one of the questions is, how come the Bible doesn't mention her? Well, it turns out that it did. The Hebrew Bible, the name Asherah appears in the Hebrew Bible. How many times is it? They say over 40 times. It's over 40 times in the Hebrew Bible. But she was effectively erased from the English translations of the Bible, specifically the King James Version of the Bible. In the King James Version of the Bible, they replaced the name Asherah with the word grove or trees. Remember earlier I said it's important to remember that she's associated with trees, because what the King James Bible did, they said, all right, let's, every time we see the word Asherah, let's replace it with the word grove or replace it with the word tree. And so what's, interesting about that is that for the people who relied on the King James Version of the Bible, they had no idea that she even existed. The author writes, we know from biblical accounts that there were two kings who really soured on the fact that people were still worshiping this goddess, and ordered the various temples to be destroyed or shut down to center all of their worship at the Temple of Jerusalem, thus giving them more control over who was being worshipped. So now we're getting to the time where people are starting to become a monotheism. And they're wanting to purge the worship of all the other gods. And so they start to try and destroy the worship of Asherah. But the problem is that Asherah's followers were everywhere, including very influential women like Queen Jezebel. And she actually brought in hundreds of prophets for Asherah. Now, there's been a lot of ways, like I said, that they tried to destroy the worship of Asherah. They tried to literally destroy the worship of Asherah through force. I mentioned before that the King James Version of the Bible replaced the name Asherah with the word groves. And not only that, but they associated the worship of Asherah with prostitution or whoredom. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with sex work. But you could see for that time and how religious people tend to look at that as being sinful or wrong, depending on what lens of religion you're looking through. You could see where they're trying to basically smear the name of the followers of Asherah. But it's really interesting because the term used, which is, I don't know how to pronounce it completely, but Kadishtu, the term Kadishtu, which they translated as temple prostitutes, actually means priestesses or consecrated women. So they were basically trying to do a smear campaign here. But not only that, the Bible blamed goddess worship for making Yahweh jealous and leading to Jerusalem's destruction. So they banned her worship, they banned her symbols, they removed her name. And why are they doing all this, by the way? Because it's about power. It's about control. And a powerful goddess like Asherah were a threat. They were a threat to a male-dominated patriarchal society and narrative. And they wanted to leave out the divine feminine because that is very threatening to a patriarchal power structure. But it says here that King Hezekiah began the purges of any worship of Asherah. So these verses that I'm going to read are not the King James Version of the Bible. So the word Asherah is still in there. So this is the version of the Bible where the name Asherah is still included. So this is 2 Kings 18:4. He removed the high places and smashed the memorial stone to pieces and cut down the Asherah. He also crushed to pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the sons of Israel had been burning incense to it, and it was called Nehushtan. So basically, he's trying to get rid of all worship of anything else that's not worship of Yahweh. Worship of Asherah, worship of any idols. King Josiah continued this as well. 2 Kings 23:6-9 says, he also brought out the Asherah from the house of the Lord outside Jerusalem to the brook and burned it and ground it to dust and threw its dust on the graves of the common people. So he's going in and just taking anything related to Asherah, totally destroying it, grinding it to dust, throwing it on the graves. And he tore down the cubicles of the male prostitutes which were in the house of the Lord, where the women were weaving hangings for Asherah. Then he brought all the priests from the cities of Judah and defiled the high places where the priests had burned incense. And he tore down the high places of the gates that were at the entrance at the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were on one's left at the city gate. We also have evidence, the author says, of numerous verses where Israelites are being commanded not to worship Asherah. In Deuteronomy, it says, "You shall not plant yourself an Asherah of any kind of tree beside the altar of the Lord your God, which you shall make for yourself." 1 Samuel says, Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, "If you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, then remove the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you, and direct your hearts to the Lord and serve him alone, and he will save you from the hands of the Philistines." So do you see what's really going on here? We're going through a major purge from a polytheism to a henotheism to a monotheism, where you're having these prophets of the Lord or servants of Yahweh who are going out and utterly destroying anything having to do with these other gods, specifically Asherah, and saying that you must do this in order to be saved from your enemies. Because remember, Yahweh is a storm god, a war god, and this makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? This seems very much like the behavior of a war god. This is exactly how a war god would behave, exactly what a war god would do. And there's just, like I said, Asherah is mentioned over 40 times in the Hebrew Bible. So there's just verses and verses and verses of the mention of her. The Asherim was on every hill and under every luxuriant tree. They set up for themselves memorial stones and Asherim on every high hill. Let's see. Here's another one about destroying it. You are to tear down their altars and smash their memorial stones and cut down their Asherim. Smash the memorial stones, cut the Asherim to pieces, burn their carved images into the fire. So all of these things are just about complete destruction of all of this. So, I mean, I think you get the point. There are many, many, many verses. Here's another one. The king commanded Hilkiah, the high priest, to bring out of the temple of the Lord everything that had been made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the heavenly lights, and he burned them outside in the fields of the Kidron Valley and carried their ashes to Bethel. So there's a huge purge going on here, and you can think about how sad this really is. Like, think about this, having your religion, the gods that you worship, and this other religion that is dominated by this psycho god and their servants just coming in and destroying everything that's related to yours. Like, it's a completely just a cultural destruction, which is really horrible. Here's one where he removed a queen because she made an image of Asherah, and they cut it down and crushed it and burned it. So the author says, as you can see, there's a lot of references referring to Asherah. Sometimes it says sometimes referring to Asherah and sometimes referring to the sacred pole that was used to worship her, or the sacred trees that had been planted in her temple. So we have here then an example of how in the King James version of the Bible, they started eliminating the word Asherah and just replacing it with tree or grove. And so here's an example. And he set a graven image of the grove that he had made in the house, of which the Lord said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I'll put my name there forever. So you can see, if you were just reading that, you would have no idea that it was being, that a goddess was being referenced. So here's another one. We read this earlier, but here it is with the name replaced. And the king commanded Hilkiah, the high priests, and the priests of the second order to bring forth out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels that were made for Baal and for the grove and for all the hosts of heaven, and burden them without Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, etc., etc. The author says, as you can see, they put in quite a lot of effort to remove her name, although they still left an evidence of the people worshiping a grove. At minimum, they made it vague enough to leave people puzzled about who or what specifically the verse was talking about. There's a lot of weird stuff that goes on there, but you can see that this was clearly an attempt to remove this name and replace it with grove. And a lot of people had no idea who Asherah was, because the English versions of the Bible, her name was completely altered. And the author says Asherah is also associated with the title, the Queen of Heaven, as we see from the book of Jeremiah. And there were many who were reluctant to give up their worship of her. And there are some who were complaining that because they gave up the worship of her, that's why they had all these different problems. Let's see, there's this verse right here. This is in Jeremiah. It says, but since we stopped burning sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have lacked everything and have met our end by the sword and famine. And there's more verses like this as well. I think you get the point, though. It's enough reading these Bible verses. But basically, there were still a lot of people saying like, hey, we want to worship Asherah. And we stopped worshiping Asherah. Now all this bad stuff is happening. Oh, so this is interesting here. This is referring to okay, so remember earlier I mentioned God making mankind in his image, and he made them male and female. This is related to that. The author says, switching gears a little bit, God made man, and when God made man in Genesis, he made man in his image, in the image of God, and made them male and female. Isn't that telling us that there is a female aspect to God? Yeah, absolutely. How would a strictly white-bearded male father God make male and female humans in his image? And that's absolutely right. And it's really funny that you have, Christianity, mainstream Christianity is so patriarchal and are so offended if you refer to God in any sort of feminine way. But it's so clear that, just think about how it's so dumb to think that like God is male. It just doesn't make any. If God is everything, then of course God would be all things, which means God would have a feminine side. If you say that God isn't female, then there is something that God isn't. And then so you are limiting your God. And then so God is no longer infinite. That's a big problem that a lot of Christians have. So think about this. God is considered to be infinite. God is considered to be everything. Well, this leaves a lot of problems. For example, I promote the idea that we are all God and that we are all divine. Christianity, of course, does not promote that narrative. They say that humans are dirty, broken, flawed, sinful creatures, and that they have to have forgiveness given and granted to them by God the Father through Jesus Christ the Son. But you'll notice that, of course, in Christianity, we aren't divine. But you'll notice how this is a huge logical problem and a huge logical contradiction. Because if God is infinite, that means that God is everything. If God is infinite and God is everything, that means we're all part of God. We are all pieces of God. That's what that means. And if you say that we're not pieces of God, then that means that we are something that God isn't. that means we are limiting God in some way. That means that God is no longer infinite because there's something that God isn't, namely us. Therefore, we have limited God. So there's so many logical problems in Christianity. I could go all day long about it, but this is a particularly interesting one, is that if God is infinite, that means that we are God and everything is God. Because if you think in the beginning, right, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, blah, blah, blah. Well, think about it. What did God create the heavens and the earth out of? It's not like there was some rocks over there in the corner of the void and some bricks and wood over there. And no, there was obviously no material. God had to create the world out of himself. That's the only way to manifest anything, is through himself. If God created something, then that would, if he didn't, that would mean that there was something that is not God, that there is something other than God. And therefore your God is no longer infinite. Your God is limited. There is something that God isn't. So Christianity is just all a mess. If you just think about it logically, if God is infinite, if God is all things, that means we are God. And if not, you have a big problem. You can't logically say, how can God create something that is not part of him? Where did that other thing, how can God create something that is not him? If that is all that there is, you are automatically putting in even if you say how somehow it's possible, you're putting a limitation on God because now God is no longer infinite. God is now constrained or limited in some aspect. Anyway, that's not the topic of this video, but it's an important point that I find to be very interesting and one that people don't consider. People don't think about it. By the way, hey, if you're watching the replay, what do you think about the candles? Do you like the candles? Tell me in the comments. I'm trying to decide on whether I want to have candles or not. I know there's just a couple of them up there. That's just because I only have, if I like them, I'm going to put more candles up there. So here's what I want you to tell me in the comments. 1, do you like the candles? 2, if you do like the candles, do you like the red candles or would you prefer white candles? Because I think white candles might look better. I just don't own any white candles. Let me know. Tell me in the comments. Anyway, let's continue. I digress here because, so as it turns out, the concept of the Holy Spirit existed before Christianity. The Jews called it Shekinah, and it represents God's immanence, but it's also a nurturing and compassionate quality. It's depicted as a radiant light, cloud, or dove. This should sound similar to any Christians out there. They give this quality of God feminine traits and refer to it as she, but rather than see it as a separate female God, they see it as a modality of God. Yeah, that's very true. In Judaism, there's the idea of the Shekinah, which is a mode of God, and it has a lot of feminine qualities and referred to as she, which is cool. That's cool. And the article says, if you've read my previous articles, you see how these sorts of mental gymnastics are required to keep this stuff classified as monotheistic. And Shekinah is also referred to as the divine feminine and the queen of heaven. In Kabbalah, Shekinah is part of the Sephirot and represents the divine feminine in their cosmic structure. So as I was saying before, if God is infinite, of course, this includes femininity. God is masculine, God is feminine, God is everything. Our idea of masculine and feminine is culturally constructed anyway. It's simply the idea that all things, all attributes are what God is in potential and then in actuality as those potentialities are actualized. It would be very silly to think not. And yeah, there's a lot of mental gymnastics to keep Christianity or any of these monotheistic religions as monotheism. Like think about Christianity. Christianity is considered a monotheism, that there's only one God. But there's God the Father, Jesus the Son, and then the Holy Spirit. And you never get a logical answer as to how they say, oh, well, they're all one God. They're three God, they're three but one, 3 in 1. It's the Trinity. And you never get a logical answer as to how this could possibly be the case. It's just like, oh, well, it kind of is. I remember being taught that in Sunday school. I'm an ex-Christian. I remember being taught like, oh, it's like an egg. When you have an egg, you have the shell, you have the yolk, and then you have the, what do you call the white part of the egg? I forget. Then you have the white part of the egg. You have the, oh, it's just called the white, right? The white of the egg. You have the shell, the white, and then the yolk. And they would say, see, it's one egg, but three things. It's 3 in 1. That's kind of like God. Well, okay, but yeah, if you're reading like a story children's book, okay, you might get away with that. But if you're trying to really imply that this is the foundation of reality, you have to be a little more direct and strict with what this is. So yeah, they try and say that it's like, oh, different aspects of God, but it does not make a whole lot of sense. Now, if you understand the system according to how we understand reality, of course, all this makes a lot of sense, because reality is one and many at the same time. We're not like, oh, there is only one God. There are many souls, but these souls form a network mind, which makes the absolute. So one network. So you can see how like we can easily answer, is there one God or many gods? Well, if you consider a soul, what we are, to be God, there are both one and many. Both at the same time. Well, isn't that just like the Trinity, aren't you? No, because we can logically say how this is the case. Logically, you can have one network composed of many nodes. A network is one and many at the same time. A network is singular. There's one network, but it's composed of many nodes. Easy, simple, and done. You have one network composed of many nodes. Thus, it's one and many at the same time. The absolute, all reality, the zeta configuration, is a network mind. It's a singular network composed of nodes or souls or containers of sinusoidal waveforms. Whatever you want to call them, doesn't matter. What we are is an eternal network that is both one and many at the same time. And there's no logical problem with that. You're going to have a lot of logical problems with an idea like the Trinity when you're like, well, there's only one God, but he's got a son. And there's the Holy Spirit. And, you know, they're kind of the same, but they're not. It's like an egg. Doesn't make any sense. So anyway, let's see if there's anything else to put here. But the concept of having a male God that made male and female in his image doesn't make any sense. There's a reason that the female aspects of God have existed throughout history. Essentially, in all life we see in nature has male and female traits. Even in plants in the process of pollination share this quality with us and animals. I think we need to be really careful here, because they are right that first of all, removing the female aspect of God was a huge problem, because now we have this horrible patriarchal religion that has completely destroyed the world and stripped women's rights, and everyone suffers because of that. So, but we have to be careful when we're thinking about in terms of gender, like the author saying, oh, well, everything has a male and female part of it. We have to be very careful. That's not true. We have to remember male and female is just symbolic of complementary or opposing or antithetical forces. So you can think of like right brain functions versus left brain functions. You know, you have reason versus creativity and meaning, conscious versus the unconscious, etc. It's not what is male and what is female, and what are male and female attributes are culturally constructed. For example, very often you see intuition and many different traditions being associated with femininity. Intuition is female. But if you look at some traditions, like the tarot, intuition is associated with a masculine trait. Intuition is masculine according to that tradition. And you have a lot of these swapped around. What is male and what is female gets swapped around depending on what culture. You know, if it's a Japanese culture versus, Christian American culture, it's going to be completely different. So we always have to keep that in mind, to remember that what we refer to as male and female are just words and symbols that we give to something. And you could give them, you could call it yin and yang. You could just do the left hemispheric functions with the right hemispheric functions. You could do whatever you'd like. But we have to be careful and remember that it's not literally strictly male and female, because then you're going to get into all these problems with like, oh, well, maybe only men and women should get married. Maybe it's wrong for men to get married because that's contrary to the nature of reality. No, it's not at all. It's perfectly acceptable for people to love whoever they want to love. And it has nothing to do with violating some eternal principle in existence. That's very silly. We are all energetic beings of frequency. We're all mathematical beings. God doesn't have a penis or a vagina. Our souls don't have a penis or a vagina. We are immaterial mathematical entities exploring our various transformations. These transformations can express themselves in many different ways. And culturally, we can assign different attributes to different ways of behaving, but that's going to change depending on what history or time or place you're in. So I just always want to stress that because this idea starts to leak into a lot of spirituality in a very toxic way sometimes, where it's like, oh, the divine feminine and divine masculine, nothing wrong with that as long as you realize that it is symbolic and representative. And then don't think, oh, all men have to behave this way and all females have to behave this way, which I see a lot in the spiritual community, which is like, hey, if you want to live that way, that's great, but don't try and pretend like it's some law written in the fabric of the cosmos, because it isn't. Ultimately, we're mathematical, energetic beings of frequencies that express themselves in many different transformations, and being like, well, there's two is really small-minded. Anyway, let's see. Yeah, so I like this. So why did any of this happen? The author says their motive for this has likely been an attempt to subjugate women to men by elevating men to being the ultimate being in control with no female presence at all, as it sends a message to anyone practicing this religion that women are less than men. This misogynistic message is then continued throughout the Bible. It absolutely is. And anyone who says, oh, it's only Old Testament, no, it's very much in New Testament. New Testament says that women can't have authority over men, that they must be quiet, they must submit to their husbands in everything, that their body belongs to their husband, etc. Horrible. And it's in the New Testament. So the author continues by saying, by allowing there to be a wife of God or female aspect of God, it would send a message of equality between sexes, two halves of a whole, a message that the patriarchs of the past or present would not want to get out. Sadly, power never wants to let go of the reins. Thankfully, Judaism and Christianity failed to fully erase this goddess. She's still there if you just look for her. And I think that's a beautiful thing to say. And I imagine how much better Christianity would be if it wasn't a patriarchal religion, but was had equal status to the feminine as well. Had equal status. It wouldn't be perfect, because there would probably still be this weird idea of like, oh, well, only male and female is valid. But I'm sure it would be leaps and bounds better than what it is today. And we see this sick culture that continuously over and over again attempts to suppress the feminine aspect. And hey, that just makes the world shittier for everyone. It makes the world shittier for all genders, and especially for men. If you repress the feminine, guess what? You're going to create a world where the feminine is lacking. And you're going to create a world where, well, men can no longer express their emotions. Men are going to have a hard time finding partners. Men are going to have, you're making the world shittier for all genders when you do that. So, I'm for, rights for all genders. And that includes men. There are a lot of things that are unfair to men. Specifically like I had mentioned, men not being able to express their emotions, men being treated as utilitarian, like, oh, and disposable, like, oh, you can just go to war and die. There's a lot of stuff that's very bad about how men are treated. But this is in large part due to the fact that it's a patriarchal society. They've essentially shot themselves at, what's that meme where it's the guy riding the bike and he sticks the stick in the spokes and he falls off the bike? And it would be like, why did women do this to me? It's like, you did it to yourself. So there are a ton of problems that men face today, and it's hard. But part of what will fix that is by dismantling a patriarchal system and having equitable gender interactions and just equality of gender is what would help fix all the problems out there. And that's why this whole thing is important. When we take a look at Asherah, who was erased from the Bible, it's been going on throughout history. So we need a resurgence of the goddess. We need a resurgence of the divine feminine to balance out all this patriarchal bullshit that's absolutely destroying our world. So my friends, I hope you enjoyed this video. I have a lot more videos. Tell me if you want to see a video on the Father of God. Let me know if you want to see a breakdown of that. Tell me if you like the candles. That's very important. Let me know. And of course, become a member if you want to be a part of our members only video that we're having right after this and all the weekly members only videos. This one is called Near-Death Experiences versus Psychedelics. We're going to be comparing and contrasting them, see what's really going on there. And all those videos, when you are a member at the Pathfinder tier or higher, are there for you to watch. Check out my new book, Meta-Rationalism, The New Science of Mind. Check it out. Links for everything are in the description of this video, as well as to my podcast on Spotify. And I want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports, especially Renaissance Fairy, Cassidy, Angela, DB, Nusalina, Christopher Smith, Eon, and Vanessa. You guys are great. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone.